Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today as we talk more about IT spend challenges within the public sector. My name is Mallory Beaudreau, and I lead account management at Apptio, an IBM company, and I am joined here by two fantastic guests. Richard, would you like to introduce yourself first?
Sure, thanks, Mallory. My name is Richard Warwick. I'm an associate partner in IBM Consulting, and I'm also a research lead with IBM's Institute for Business Value.
Fantastic. And Greg, over to you.
Thanks, Mallory. Greg Holmes. I'm field CTO for Apptio in EMEA. I've got 20 years experience working in the world of IT spend, so things like cloud, AI, software licensing, and all sorts of infrastructure. Happy to talk about the public sector.
Yeah. And today is all about some of the challenges that we are seeing and hearing in tech spend specific to public sector. Of course, private sector will benefit from hearing some of this as well, along with some practical ideas on what public sector can do to really maximize the limited budgets that they have. But let's start with something fairly topical, which is the trends around budgeting and limited budget, looking at what we're able to borrow. This is a huge topic in the UK at the minute. So, Greg, what trends are you seeing at the moment that are specific to challenges for IT spend?
Yeah, I think there's a lot around trying to modernize the different kinds of services that government organizations are offering to citizens. And really, how do they manage understanding whether they're giving value back to the citizens or they're just trying to run certain services cheaper than before, right? So I think there's a bit of a battle, and I think there's also, it's somewhat politically inspired because it's also about whether the organizations are able to deliver on that promise of innovation.
And Richard, let's zoom out a bit too globally, because you've got experience in the US public sector. What are you seeing and hearing?
Mallory, what we're seeing now is sort of a triple witching hour where pressures on IT costs are nothing new. IT organizations are generally managed as cost centers. But now what we see is there's so much pressure to explore new investments in AI. And as we look at those investments in AI, we're starting to see the kind of technical debt that those investments are encountering. And so now the IT organization is under the usual cost pressure that comes with being a cost center, the need to find money within flat budgets to invest in things like AI, and the growing realization that those investments are going to run into a ton of work that will cost money to modernize the systems sufficiently to do AI effectively. So it's if it was ever an easy job, it's not an easy job now.
Well, you've touched on something that's crucial here. When we're talking about IT spend, a lot of it, up to 40%, can be labor. And is that labor the right labor for your innovation? Richard, can you tell us more about being pulled in those two directions between tech debt and this innovation, and share some examples and sort of how that really pulls on the skills and also the infrastructure that public sector needs?
Well, Sharon, I'll lead with a story. We did a little research to confirm a hypothesis that part of the pressure on IT budgets is just the pace of change and what's being required of IT. And this is true for public sector as well as private. The question we asked was, if the tech executives in the IT organization look at the strategic portfolio they're being asked to support. This is the CEO, this is the leader of an agency saying, what I want from IT right now is more of this or less of that, the strategic input that the CIO is always looking for. We asked how many of those initiatives would change significantly from 2025 to 26. And then we asked the same question, how much would they change from 26 to 27? And what we learned is that by 27, the portfolio of strategic directions would change almost entirely, right? Which means that the half-life of the strategic initiative that the CIO is responding to is more like months than years. And so now we've got a flat IT budget, and what rises to the top is this need for responding to constant change. That whatever the architecture looked like last year, it will probably have to be a little bit different next year. Whatever services we're providing today will be a little bit different, if not entirely different, tomorrow. And so the pressure on IT then is to become radically more flexible in its ability to pivot and say, without completely redoing the architecture, without completely remediating the tech debt that we have, how do we still change direction as political winds blow, as the global economy changes, as tariffs happen? And so it's the pressure we see right now is exacerbated so much by the need to continue to pivot to different strategic initiatives without incurring the cost of regenerating the larger architecture every time the game changes.
Well, to what extent is that driven by election cycles versus an overall need to innovate and innovate at all costs in some cases?
Well, quite a bit. Certainly with election cycles, it's not entirely different in the public sector. What the CIO is trying to do is to get ahead of the curve a little bit and say, I've got to, the fancy word for this is strategic optionality, right? How can I look into my crystal ball as best I can and say, given what I know about what will probably change, how can I put a foundation in place that stays relatively stable while also permitting me to change direction? So from an IT point of view, a lot of what we're seeing with IT organizations and their interest in things like APIs are an example of saying, how do I maintain the core, modernize that core, but also be very flexible to say, the way I'm delivering this service today will probably change within a few months, if not a year.
Now, Greg, you would assume to a certain extent, because it is all public sector, it is in theory all one government, that there would be some continuity of systems. But that's not what you've observed. Can you tell us more about competing platforms, competing applications and solutions across the government?
Yeah, I think in many departments of the government and branches, there's definitely innovation going on, but a lot of organizations have picked their own path to doing some of these bits of innovation and using different technology platforms, different data storage, things like that. And by making these decisions, it actually it incurs a bit of that technical debt that we were talking about earlier, in that it locks in certain ways that you can access that data, certain ways that you'd have to work if you wanted to build interfaces together. So in many ways, it's about having some foresight and planning to underline some strategic directions that you want to follow. But again, we want people to be innovative. So to be innovative, you often have to make a choice to use whatever the platforms available for that kind of innovation are. If you want to use the most options for innovations and services, you're usually looking at cloud deployments, which then mean that you have a certain level of lock-in into those cloud providers, and then you're making choices about where data goes and things like that because of those choices. So I think it builds in an element of selection, which then needs to be thought about from the strategic point of view of, if you want these things to play together in the future, how do you then bring them back from that choice?
So let's talk more about how do you look for inefficiencies? How do you make these kind of strategic choices on where to save and where to invest? Because to your point, Richard, if you've got a set budget, but you're trying to innovate, that money has to come from somewhere. Retraining people or hiring new people has to come from somewhere. How should public sector be thinking about that?
I think a very basic way to think about that is from the concept of just transparency. Transparency and the ability to map costs to outcomes. A lot of what IT organizations generate, it's not even a single ledger. It's many, many ledgers of costs that are granular costs that are coming from, I'm consuming this service, I'm paying this bill to this vendor, I have an upgrade here that is part of that budget. And so it's a long, 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 long list of checks that the IT organization is being asked to cut. So as we start to look for inefficiencies, what we're trying to do is say, which of those expenses is not adding to my ability to deliver the services that citizens expect? And it's not as easy. Maybe it doesn't even sound easy. It certainly isn't easy, right? It usually takes, what we have found is that a lot of organizations actually have the machinery, the data, the tools necessary to track even rather granular levels of spending to the programs that they support. But it takes time, it takes labor. It's not something, it's typically something that takes organizations a while to figure out how to do. But once they have that in place, then the business is saying, okay, having mapped a lot of these expenses to the programs that they support, I still have a lot of stuff in the garage. There's a lot going on here that I could not map to something that my agency gets credit for delivering. That becomes a wonderful place to cut, because you're cutting things that no one is protecting, right? That garage full of misfit toys are expenses that people won't miss. But the trick is figuring out which of these expenses are really waste, right? And which are, at least at the surface, supporting something that I'm trying to do for the citizenry.
And this is where visibility is so important, because if you don't have a label on that box in the garage, you need to get inside there and find out if it's old family photos and heirlooms,
Yeah.
or if it's packing peanuts from 2 moves ago. And
Right.
to take this into tech spend, right? This is where that visibility is crucial, of what is it doing, and then how does it serve our citizens, right? Because fundamentally that is what they're trying to do. So Greg, tell us a little bit more about what good looks like when you bring those different data sets together.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it's really about making sure that the organization has a concept of what outcomes is it trying to achieve, and how do you measure those outcomes, right? So, as Richard's example, right, if you're trying to run a service for a certain number of consumers, whether they're citizens or other departments or requests of various kinds, what we'd like to do is actually align that service and the cost of delivering that service to the cost of how many outcomes are we trying to drive. And if you can do that, we call it unit economics. Basically, you then get a clearer understanding of are we actually putting the resources that we're using to good use? Are they getting better, more? Are they scaling up better as we scale up the service? And also, I think you need to look at, if you're scaling down the service and you don't need to offer it as many times, you need then a natural way to allow costs to be taken out of it, or else you end up with a bloated cost of service per the unit costs of that service.
Absolutely. What I did want to talk about is an example of one of the UK government departments that we're working with at the minute, who they are trying to measure the cost, the technical cost, to serve each call into its department. So a citizen calls, they have a specific need for this department. And this is a great example of what Greg is saying of the unit economics. We need to marry that data together, because the data exists. It just exists in completely different silos. So it's a combination of owners, application owners, who have the call data, combined with the cloud, the technical owners who have the spend and maybe the breakdown of the infrastructure. Marry that data together to understand, okay, during peak season, we hire some additional people, so the cost per call is a little higher, but we're willing to tolerate that because the wait time is minimalized. In our slower season, there's a slightly longer wait time, but it's fairly small because we just don't have as many calls. Giving that number in the context of another number always enables you to have a better, more value-driven conversation. And that's true regardless of public or private sector. That's just one of many examples where, Richard, to your point, the data exists, but Greg, to your point, we really need to put it into one place.
Well, and it gets worse. That data exists, it's in multiple silos, and we're not agreeing on what to call it, right? So a lot of what organizations don't have to invent is, if you look at all the work being done in the field of technology business management, TBM. If you go to the TBM Council, this is publicly available information where organizations have already done the homework to say, let's call this piece of technology by this name, right? And let's agree on a common definition for what that means, and a common definition for how to track that cost, right? And it's all homework, it's all staff work that someone needs to do, but it's foundational to be to be able to do, Mallory, just what you said. I mean, can we start to say, how much does it cost me to answer that phone call? How much does it cost to process a tax return? Unit economics. But we have to map those costs to that economic. And it starts by saying, are we even agreeing up front on what that cost is, what we call it, how we classify it, right? Is it a tower? Is it a bucket? And again, it's staff work. It's not sexy, but it's the foundation for having reasonably clear conversations about the problem that we're trying to solve.
Exactly that. I think my one piece of advice to public sector in general would be break down those silos. And I think the clarion call there is because public sector, you have sort of a general culture of we are here to serve, we are here to make the most out of a limited budget and ensure that whatever our mission is as a department, that we're delivering it. And so that creates a bit more of a compelling reason to break down those silos, get a little uncomfortable by looking at someone else's data, asking hard questions. To wrap up, what advice would you give to public sector as they look at the challenges around IT spend? Greg, you go first.
So I think one of the things is the pressure on CIOs and tech budgets in general is often coming from outside of the tech teams, right? It's getting challenged by the departments, by the politicians to deliver new things in place of other costs outside of IT often. So in order to deliver this, the tech budget needs to move money out of just running the same old stuff into those change and innovation projects. So I think what organizations really need is reimagining, is there a cheaper way to do some of these things that they've been doing for some time, and getting away from just the same old, but also, how do they turn the assets that they've got now into things that can be used to innovate and change?
Yeah, what I'd add to that, and it's true of every case study I've seen, everything I've seen directly from my experience in the public sector, is that at the end of the day, it boils down to relationships. And the relationship specifically is between the CIO and the people in the finance organization, right? Because so much of what we're talking about, even starting with how much money goes to the IT organization, has to have some agreement with the financial side of the organization. And where we've seen this work well is where there is a growing understanding between the IT folks and the finance folks that a lot of what we think are set rules are not rules at all. It's just the way we've been doing things. And so, for instance, the critical agreement that has to occur at some point, so this is all just not magical thinking, is for the finance organization to agree that when the IT organization succeeds in cutting some costs, that they can retain some of those proceeds to reinvest in modernization, to reinvest in further cost cutting. But there has to be, for any big outcomes to occur, there has to be a change in this sort of convention that if we cut costs, that means I just get a lower budget, right? When that dynamic is in place, it's very hard for good things to happen.
Yep, exactly that. So, Richard, exactly what you're saying. We don't need to have this concept of scarcity where we're taking things away. In fact, by working together, we can give you something. We can give you the resources you need to hire someone or invest in something new. So I want to thank you both so much for joining me today. Again, I'm Mallory Beaudreau. I'm joined by Richard Warwick and Greg Holmes. You heard directly from them. Public sector, you've got limited budgets. You're pulled in multiple directions between innovation and your tech debt. And at the end of the day, you want to serve your citizens. So don't be afraid to ask hard questions. Bring that data set together. Look for ways to make 1 + 1 = 3. Thank you so much for tuning in. You can join us next time where we'll talk more about strategies on how to maximize the tech investments that you make. Thank you so much.